The morning mist clung to the Naktong River like a shroud over the dying dreams of a free South Korea. It was August 4th, 1950, and Lieutenant Colonel John Michaelis stood on Hill 255, watching through his binoculars as endless columns of North Korean People's Army soldiers moved like ants across the distant ridgelines. Behind him, the port city of Pusan, the last remaining stronghold of the Republic of Korea, buzzed with the desperate activity of a nation fighting for its very existence. 3 months earlier, the world had watched in stunned silence as Kim Il-sung's forces crashed across the 38th parallel with the fury of a summer storm. What was supposed to be a police action had become a rout of biblical proportions. American and South Korean forces, caught completely off guard, had been pushed back in a retreat that seemed to have no end. Seoul had fallen in just 3 days. Daejeon had crumbled after brave but futile resistance. Now squeezed into a rectangular box barely 140 miles long and 50 miles wide, the combined United Nations forces faced what appeared to be their final stand. Michaelis adjusted his helmet and turned to his radio operator. The weight of command pressed down on him like the humid Korean summer air. His 27th Infantry Regiment, part of the 25th Infantry Division, had been reduced to barely half strength during the nightmarish retreat. Men who had been laughing and playing cards just weeks ago in peaceful garrison duty in Japan were now hollow-eyed veterans of a dozen desperate rearguard actions. The statistics were terrifying. General Walton Walker's 8th Army, which had once numbered nearly 75,000 strong, was now down to fewer than 50,000 effective combat troops. The South Korean forces, though numbering close to 90,000 on paper, were in even worse condition. Many units had simply melted away during the retreat, their soldiers returning to their villages to protect their families or simply to escape the seemingly hopeless fight. The Pusan perimeter, as military planners were already calling it, represented the absolute minimum territory needed to maintain the vital port that kept the United Nations forces supplied. Loose Pusan, and the entire peninsula would fall to the communists. The implications stretched far beyond Korea itself. President Harry Truman had staked American prestige on containing communist expansion. General Douglas MacArthur, the legendary World War II hero now commanding all United Nations forces in Korea, had publicly declared that there would be no American withdrawal from Asia on his watch. But declarations and reality were two different things. The North Koreans had proven to be far more formidable than anyone in Washington or Tokyo had anticipated. Their T-34 tanks, supplied by the Soviet Union, had crushed through every defensive line the Americans had tried to establish. Their infantry, many of whom were battle-hardened veterans of the Chinese Civil War, moved with a tactical sophistication that had caught Western military experts completely by surprise. As Michaelis studied the approaching enemy formations, he couldn't help but think of Valley Forge, of the Alamo, of all those moments in history when desperate men had been called upon to hold impossible positions against overwhelming odds. The difference was that this time, the eyes of the world were watching. Radio correspondents were broadcasting the unfolding drama to millions of American homes. The fall of the Pusan perimeter wouldn't just mean military defeat, it would mean the collapse of American credibility in the Cold War struggle that was defining the second half of the 20th century. According to Korean War Legacy Foundation records, the initial defensive positions around the Pusan perimeter were established by a force of approximately 140,000 United Nations troops facing an estimated 90,000 North Korean soldiers. The irony wasn't lost on any of the Americans dug in along the perimeter. They had come to Korea expecting an easy victory against what they assumed would be a ragtag army of communist irregulars. Instead, they found themselves fighting for their lives against a well-equipped, highly motivated enemy that seemed to have studied every American tactical manual ever written. The Korean People's Army had learned to avoid the roads where American firepower was most effective, instead moving through the mountainous terrain with an agility that left their opponents constantly off balance. General Walton Harris Walker stood in the sweltering heat of his command post in Taegu, sweat beading on his weathered forehead as he studied the situation map that told the story of American military disaster in stark red and blue lines. The red arrows representing North Korean advances seemed to pierce every defensive position his forces had tried to hold. The blue rectangles marking United Nations units appeared pitifully small against the vast expanse of enemy-controlled territory. Walker was a soldier's soldier, a veteran of both world wars who had earned his reputation leading armored spearheads across Europe under George Patton. But Korea was unlike anything he had ever faced. The enemy refused to fight the kind of conventional battle that American doctrine was designed to win. Instead of massing for direct confrontation, the North Koreans infiltrated around fixed positions, struck at supply lines, and melted away into the mountains before superior American firepower could be brought to bear. The general's aide, Colonel Eugene Landrum, approached with the latest intelligence reports. The news was uniformly grim. The North Korean First Corps was probing the northern approaches to the perimeter near Wegwon. The Second Corps was pressing hard against the central positions around Changnyeong. Most ominously, the 4th Division had managed to establish bridgeheads across the Nakhtong River at multiple points, threatening to crack the western side of the perimeter wide open. Walker had made his decision 48 hours earlier, and it was the kind of decision that could either save an army or destroy a career. There would be no more retreats. Every unit, from the smallest squad to the largest regiment, would hold its assigned position or die trying. He had communicated this order in characteristically blunt terms. We are going to hold this line. We are going to win. There will be no Dunkirk. There will be no Bataan. A retreat to Pusan would be one of the greatest butcheries in history. The weight of that decision pressed down on every commander in the perimeter. Major General William Dean, who had been captured during the fall of Daejeon, was already being paraded before North Korean propaganda cameras. The thought of what would happen to the entire 8th Army if the perimeter collapsed was too terrible to contemplate. Colonel Paul Freeman of the 23rd Infantry Regiment had positioned his men along a particularly vulnerable section of the line near Chipyong. His soldiers, many of them barely out of their teens, had been digging foxholes and stringing barbed wire for 72 hours straight. The red clay soil of Korea stuck to everything, uniforms, weapons, skin, until every man looked like he had been dipped in rust-colored mud. Freeman walked among his positions as the sun began to set on August 6th, stopping to talk with individual soldiers, checking fields of fire, examining ammunition stocks. These boys, and most of them were boys, had enlisted in the peacetime army expecting to serve their time in comfortable garrison duty. Instead, they found themselves in holes in the ground, waiting for human wave attacks by an enemy that seemed to have unlimited numbers. Private First Class Jimmy Collins from Oklahoma looked up as his colonel approached. Collins had been in Korea for exactly 11 days and had already seen more combat than most World War II veterans experienced in months of fighting. His hands shook slightly as he cleaned his M1 rifle for the dozenth time that day. "Sir," he said, his voice cracking slightly, "how long do you think we can hold them?" Freeman knelt beside the youngster's foxhole, noting the careful way Collins had positioned his ammunition and the professional competence with which he had prepared his position, despite his obvious fear. "Son," the colonel said quietly, "we're going to hold them as long as it takes. The Marines are coming. The Air Force is coming. MacArthur's got something cooking that's going to change everything. But right now, right here, it's up to us." What Freeman didn't tell the private was that the something cooking was still weeks away from reality. The Incheon landing was still in the planning stages, and even if it succeeded, the 8th Army would have to hold the perimeter long enough for MacArthur's brilliant gamble to pay off. Every day they held, every attack they repulsed, every small victory they achieved was buying time for the larger strategic picture to develop. The North Koreans understood this as well as anyone. Their own intelligence had detected the buildup of forces in Japan, the increased naval activity around the peninsula. Time was not on their side either. If they were going to crush the Pusan perimeter and drive the United Nations forces into the sea, it had to happen quickly, before American industrial might and logistical superiority could be brought fully to bear. The pre-dawn darkness of August 8th was shattered by the thunder of North Korean artillery as the 4th Division launched its most determined assault yet on the western face of the Pusan perimeter. Major General Kong Kon, commanding the attack, had massed nearly every available gun and mortar for a bombardment that was intended to break the spirit of the defending Americans before his infantry even crossed the Naktong River. Staff Sergeant Marcus Washington of the 2nd Battalion, 24th Infantry Regiment, pressed his face into the muddy bottom of his foxhole as high explosive rounds walked across his position like the footsteps of an angry giant. Washington was a veteran of the Italian campaign in World War II, and he had never experienced artillery fire this intense. The ground shook with each impact, and the air itself seemed to vibrate with the continuous roar of incoming shells. When the barrage finally lifted, Washington raised his head to see hundreds of North Korean soldiers swarming across the rice paddies toward his position. They moved in short rushes, using the natural folds in the terrain and the morning mist to mask their approach. Behind them came the dreaded T-34 tanks, their broad tracks crushing through the irrigation ditches as easily as a man might step over puddles. The battle that followed would later be called the First Battle of the Naktong Bulge, and it represented everything that made the Pusan perimeter defense so critical. American units, many of them composed largely of hastily trained recruits, found themselves fighting hand-to-hand against seasoned communist soldiers who showed no inclination to retreat, even when facing overwhelming firepower. Lieutenant Robert Hayes led his platoon from the 9th Infantry Regiment in a desperate counterattack against North Korean forces that had managed to establish a foothold on the American side of the river. Hayes had graduated from West Point just 2 years earlier, and the tactics he had studied in comfortable classrooms suddenly took on life-and-death urgency as he maneuvered his men through a landscape torn apart by explosions and littered with the bodies of both armies. The young lieutenant's radio crackled with reports from other sectors. The North Korean advance was succeeding along multiple axes of attack. Units were being overrun, communication lines were being cut, and the carefully planned defensive positions that had taken weeks to prepare were crumbling under the weight of the communist assault. But something remarkable was happening among the American soldiers. Despite their youth, despite their lack of combat experience, despite the terror that gripped every man as enemy mortars searched for their positions, they were not breaking. The stand or die order issued by General Walker had crystallized something fundamental in the character of these young Americans. They were not professional soldiers in the European sense, but they were the products of a democratic society that had just emerged victorious from the greatest war in human history. The Defense Department's official history notes that during the critical August battles, United Nations forces successfully repelled multiple North Korean attempts to break through the perimeter, despite being outnumbered in several sectors. Corporal Eddie Martinez from New Mexico found himself manning a machine gun position that became the focal point of an entire North Korean company's attack. Martinez had never fired his weapon in combat before August 1st, but as wave after wave of enemy soldiers approached his position, he discovered reserves of courage he didn't know he possessed. His gun crew, working with the mechanical precision of men whose lives depended on their efficiency, fed belt after belt of ammunition into their weapon until the barrel glowed red-hot in the pre-dawn darkness. The mathematics of the battle were simple and terrible. The North Koreans had to break through. The Americans had to hold. There was no middle ground, no room for tactical sophistication or strategic maneuvering. This was warfare reduced to its most fundamental elements: will, courage, and the capacity to endure unimaginable stress while continuing to function as soldiers. As the sun rose higher, American artillery and air support began to turn the tide of the battle. The proximity of Pusan airfield meant that fighter bombers could be overhead within minutes of being called. The concentration of forces within the perimeter meant that every available gun could be brought to bear on any threatened sector. The North Koreans, who had become accustomed to fighting an enemy that was always retreating, suddenly found themselves facing the full weight of American firepower for the first time in the war. By August 15th, the character of the fighting around the Pusan perimeter had fundamentally changed. What had begun as a desperate last stand by a defeated army was evolving into something far more significant. A demonstration of what American forces could accomplish when they had their backs to the wall and were fighting from prepared positions with adequate supplies and air support. Major General William Keane, commanding officer of the 25th Infantry Division, stood in his forward command post watching through field glasses as his task force Keane launched a counterattack that would have been unthinkable just weeks earlier. The task force, built around the 5th Regimental Combat Team and the 1st Provisional Marine Brigade, represented the first time since the beginning of the war that United Nations forces had taken the offensive with realistic expectations of success. The Marines had arrived in Korea with a reputation that preceded them like thunder before lightning. These were the men who had stormed Pacific beaches from Guadalcanal to Iwo Jima. They brought with them not just additional manpower, but something equally valuable: an unshakable confidence in their ability to defeat any enemy under any circumstances. When Marine Colonel Raymond Murray told his battalion commanders that they were going to push the North Koreans back across the Naktong River, no one questioned whether it could be done. The only question was how quickly it could be accomplished. Captain Joseph Fegan led his company of the 1st Battalion, 5th Marines, in an assault on Hill 311 that became a textbook example of combined arms warfare. Marine Corsair fighter bombers worked in close coordination with artillery and ground forces to systematically destroy North Korean defensive positions that had been holding up American advances for days. The precision and professionalism of the attack stood in stark contrast to the desperate, improvised battles that had characterized the earlier fighting. The psychological impact of the Marine arrival extended far beyond their actual numbers. American soldiers who had been fighting with the constant knowledge that they were part of a defeated army suddenly found themselves part of a force that was winning battles and taking territory. The change in morale was almost palpable. Men, who had been digging defensive positions for weeks, suddenly found themselves planning offensive operations. Colonel John Michaelis, whose 27th Infantry Regiment had been holding a crucial sector of the perimeter since the beginning of August, noticed the change immediately. His soldiers were standing straighter, joking more, complaining less, about the heat and the food and the constant threat of enemy infiltration. They had discovered something that military historians would later identify as one of the key factors in American military success: the realization that they were not just fighting for their own lives, but for principles and values that were worth defending. The North Koreans, meanwhile, were discovering the limits of their own capabilities. The tactics that had worked so brilliantly during their advance down the peninsula, night attacks, infiltration, the use of terrain to negate American firepower, advantages, were far less effective against an enemy that was no longer retreating. American forces dug into prepared positions with overlapping fields of fire, and supported by concentrated artillery proved to be a much tougher proposition than the scattered, demoralized units they had been pursuing for months. General Walker moved his headquarters forward to Miryang, a clear signal that he believed the crisis had passed. The move was both practical and symbolic. Practical because it put him closer to the fighting and improved his ability to coordinate the increasingly complex defensive operations. Symbolic because it demonstrated to every soldier in the perimeter that their commanding general had confidence in their ability to hold the line. The international implications of the Pusan perimeter's successful defense were becoming clear to observers in Washington, Moscow, and Beijing. President Truman, who had been under enormous political pressure to either escalate dramatically or withdraw entirely from Korea, suddenly found himself with viable military options. The successful defense proved that American forces could fight effectively in Korea, given proper preparation and support. More importantly, the defense of the perimeter was buying time for General MacArthur to prepare the masterstroke that would change the entire strategic picture in Korea. The Incheon landing, still weeks away, required extensive preparation and the assembly of forces from throughout the Pacific Theater. Every day that the Eighth Army held the perimeter was another day for MacArthur's planners to refine their preparations for what would become one of the most audacious amphibious operations in military history. The morning of September 1st brought with it the heaviest fighting yet seen around the Pusan perimeter. General Kim Chek, commanding the North Korean forces, had committed his strategic reserve in one final, desperate attempt to crack the United Nations defense before MacArthur's mysterious preparations in Japan could come to fruition. Intelligence reports suggested that something major was being planned, and Kim knew that time was running out for a North Korean victory. Colonel Paul Freeman found his 23rd Infantry Regiment under attack from three sides as the North Korean 13th Division launched a coordinated assault designed to split the perimeter in half. Freeman had been in command long enough to recognize the difference between a probing attack and an all-out offensive. This was clearly the latter. The intensity of the artillery bombardment, the use of armor in broad daylight, the willingness to accept massive casualties, all indicated that the North Koreans were betting everything on this final throw of the dice. The battle raged with an intensity that left even veteran observers stunned. Private Jerry McKinnon of the 19th Infantry Regiment later described the fighting as unlike anything he had imagined possible. You couldn't see 10 feet in any direction because of the smoke, McKinnon wrote to his parents weeks later. The noise was so loud you couldn't hear yourself think, and they just kept coming, wave after wave, like they didn't care how many of them died as long as they could get through our lines. What McKinnon and thousands of other American soldiers didn't fully understand was that they were no longer the same army that had been pushed down the peninsula in July and August. 2 months of constant combat had transformed clerks and mechanics into hardened infantry soldiers. More importantly, they had learned to fight as a team, with each man understanding his role in a larger tactical picture. Sergeant First Class Robert Taplett of the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, exemplified the new American soldier that was, emerging from the crucible of the Pusan perimeter. Taplett had been a peacetime Marine, accustomed to garrison duty and training exercises. The war had transformed him into a combat leader whose small unit tactics were studied and admired by professional soldiers throughout the United Nations forces. When North Korean infiltrators managed to penetrate deep into the Marine sector, threatening to roll up an entire company position, Taplett led a counterattack that restored the line and eliminated the penetration. His actions were typical of thousands of similar small unit engagements that collectively determined the outcome of the larger battle. The turning point came on September 10th when American forces successfully repulsed what intelligence later confirmed was the final North Korean offensive operation of the war. The cost had been terrible on both sides. American casualties for the 2 months of fighting around the perimeter exceeded 15,000 killed, wounded, and missing. North Korean losses were estimated to be nearly twice as high, but more importantly, their offensive capability had been completely exhausted. General Walker recognized the significance of the moment immediately. For the first time since June 25th, when the North Korean People's Army had crossed the 38th parallel, the initiative was passing to the United Nations forces. The successful defense of the Pusan perimeter had accomplished far more than simply preventing a communist victory. It had created the conditions for a dramatic reversal of fortune that would transform the entire strategic situation in Korea. The psychological transformation was as important as the tactical one. American soldiers who had spent months learning to fight defensively suddenly found themselves preparing for offensive operations. The change in mindset was profound. Instead of calculating how long they could hold a position, they were now planning how quickly they could advance once the order came. Intelligence reports from throughout the North Korean army indicated that their forces were experiencing serious problems with morale, supply, and unit cohesion. The failure to break the Pusan perimeter after months of effort had convinced many North Korean soldiers that their cause was hopeless. Desertion rates were climbing, and several units had simply melted away during the final offensive attempts. September 15th, 1950, dawned clear and bright over the Yellow Sea as the largest amphibious force assembled since World War II prepared to execute General MacArthur's masterstroke. 261 ships carried 70,000. United Nations troops toward the port city of Incheon, 200 miles behind North Korean lines. The audacious landing, planned while the Pusan perimeter was still under desperate siege, represented one of the most brilliant strategic gambles in military history. Admiral James Doyle, commanding the amphibious task force, studied the title. Charts one final time as his flagship approached the Korean coast. Incheon was a notoriously difficult target for amphibious operations. The tides were among the most extreme in the world, the harbor approaches were treacherous, and the city itself was heavily fortified. Every staff officer in the Pacific Theater had advised against the operation. MacArthur had overruled them all. The first wave of Marines hit the beach at exactly 0630 hours, catching the North Korean defenders completely by surprise. The Communist High Command had concentrated virtually all of their forces around the Pusan perimeter, leaving only minimal garrison forces to guard against the possibility of an amphibious landing. The strategic deception had worked perfectly. While North Korean armies exhausted themselves against Walker's defensive positions, MacArthur had been assembling the largest amphibious force since D-Day. Back at the Pusan perimeter, the sound of distant explosions and the sudden cessation of North Korean offensive operations told General Walker everything he needed to know. The Incheon landing had succeeded, and the time had come for the 8th Army to break out of the perimeter that had contained them for 2 months. Colonel Michaelis received the breakout order at 1400 hours on September 16th and immediately began preparing his 27th Infantry Regiment for offensive operations. The transformation was remarkable. Soldiers who had been conserving ammunition and digging deeper foxholes just hours earlier were now checking weapons, studying maps of North Korean territory, and discussing how quickly they could advance once the attack began. The breakout began at dawn on September 17th with the largest artillery bombardment fired by American forces since World War II. Every gun in the 8th Army, from the smallest mortars to the heaviest howitzers, participated in the barrage. The psychological effect on both armies was immediate and profound. For the Americans, it represented the moment they stopped being a defensive force and became an instrument of offensive warfare. For the North Koreans, it announced the beginning of their own retreat back up the peninsula. Captain William Caldwell led his company of the 38th Infantry Regiment in the initial assault across the Naktong River. Caldwell had been preparing for this moment since August, studying North Korean positions, identifying key terrain features, planning routes of advance. When the order finally came, his men moved with the precision and confidence of professional soldiers who knew exactly what they were supposed to accomplish. The North Korean resistance, so fierce and determined during the defensive battles, crumbled almost immediately once the United Nations forces went on the offensive. Units that had fought with fanatical determination to break through the perimeter suddenly found themselves facing a two-front war that their exhausted army could not possibly win. According to the U.S. Army's official history of the Korean War, the breakout from the Pusan perimeter began on September 16th and achieved all initial objectives within 72 hours. The link-up between MacArthur's 10th Corps advancing south from Incheon and Walker's 8th Army advancing north from the Pusan perimeter occurred on September 26th near Suwon. The strategic encirclement of the entire North Korean army was complete. In less than 2 weeks, the military situation in Korea had been completely reversed. Lieutenant Hayes, who had led his platoon in desperate defensive actions just weeks earlier, found himself accepting the surrender of an entire North Korean battalion. The contrast was almost surreal. The same soldiers who had seemed so formidable when they were attacking prepared positions now appeared demoralized and defeated when caught in the open by mobile American forces supported by overwhelming air power. The liberation of Seoul on September 28, 1950, marked the end of the Pusan perimeter campaign and the beginning of a new phase of the Korean War. As United Nations forces advanced northward toward the 38th parallel and beyond, military historians were already beginning to analyze the strategic significance of what had occurred during those desperate months when the future of South Korea hung in the balance. General Walker, now commanding an army advancing in pursuit of a defeated enemy, reflected on the transformation his forces had undergone since those dark days in August when defeat seemed inevitable. The 8th Army that broke out of the Pusan perimeter was fundamentally different from the force that had been pushed down the peninsula during the war's first months. Combat had forged it into one of the most effective fighting forces in American military history. The statistics told part of the story. During the 2 months of fighting around the perimeter, American forces had inflicted an estimated 60,000 casualties on the North Korean army while suffering approximately 20,000 themselves. More importantly, they had destroyed the offensive capability of the communist forces and created the conditions for MacArthur's brilliant strategic counterattack. But the numbers alone could not capture the psychological and strategic significance of what had been accomplished. Colonel Michaelis, whose regiment had held a crucial section of the perimeter throughout the siege, understood that they had participated in something far more significant than a successful military operation. They had demonstrated that democratic nations could field armies capable of fighting with determination equal to that of any totalitarian force. The international implications of the successful defense were immediately apparent to observers throughout the world. The myth of communist military invincibility, which had grown during the Chinese Civil War and the early phases of the Korean conflict, had been shattered by the performance of United Nations forces during the Pusan perimeter campaign. President Truman, speaking to the nation on October 1st, placed the defense of the perimeter in its broader Cold War context. The brave men who held the line in Korea have shown the world that free nations will fight for their principles and will not be intimidated by communist aggression. Their courage has changed the course of history in the Far East. The individual soldiers who had fought in the foxholes and rice paddies around Pusan understood that they had been part of something historically significant, even if they couldn't fully articulate what it meant. Staff Sergeant Washington, whose machine gun position had become legendary among the men of the 24th Infantry Regiment, received the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions during the August battles. When asked by a war correspondent what the decoration meant to him, Washington replied simply, "It means we didn't quit when things got tough." That refusal to quit had consequences that extended far beyond the Korean peninsula. The successful defense of the Pusan perimeter convinced European allies that the United States would honor its commitments under the NATO treaty. It demonstrated to potential adversaries that American forces could adapt and fight effectively, even under the most difficult circumstances. Most importantly, it established the precedent that communist expansion could be contained through determined military resistance. The transformation of individual soldiers during the campaign was equally significant. Men like Private Collins, who had been terrified farm boys from Oklahoma in August, emerged as confident combat veterans who understood that they had participated in one of the defining moments of the Cold War. The experience had changed them permanently, giving them a confidence and sense of purpose that would influence American society for decades to come. As autumn arrived in Korea and United Nations forces advanced toward the Yalu River, The officers and soldiers who had defended the Pusan perimeter began to understand that they had participated in a turning point not just in the Korean War, but in the broader struggle between democracy and communism that would define the second half of the 20th century. The perimeter had held, the line had been drawn. And in holding that line, a generation of Americans had proven that free societies could produce soldiers willing to fight and die for principles larger than themselves. The legacy of that courage would echo through every subsequent challenge faced by the United States during the long Cold War that lay ahead. The Battle of the Pusan perimeter had ended not with a dramatic charge or a decisive engagement, but with the quiet recognition that ordinary Americans, when called upon to do extraordinary things, would not be found wanting. In the end, that may have been the most important victory of all.